ethics, politics, and religion in democratic contexts, and on a variety of issues in theological anthropology, fundamental ecclesiology, and foundational theology. His teaching and research is strongly influenced by the work of Canadian Jesuit philosopher and theologian Bernard Lonergan. Thank you, Dr. Olkovich. It's a pleasure.
No, thank you, Cecile. I didn't know you were going to read the long bio there. That's wow. I sound almost accomplished. Thank you so much for the introduction. It's an honor and everybody can hear me, right? If so far so good. Okay. You let me know if for some reason I break out. I bought a microphone recently to teach online, and I was commenting to my students that I thought it was great, and then they said it actually wasn't working. So it didn't really work out. So it's an honor and pleasure to be with you this afternoon. I want to thank the organizers of this year's conference, especially Chris. Chris Kroll was really helpful with me back and forth via email. I presented a paper at the very first Lonergan on the Edge conference at Regis College in Toronto way back in 2006. I was a first-year MDiv student at the time. That's how wild is that? And this is actually my third time at the Marquette version of the conference. There's a 2010 audio recording of Jeremy Blackwood asking me about the fifth level of consciousness that still makes me laugh to this day. He burned me really bad. Yeah, so many of the people I've met through this conference over the years are now colleagues and friends. The presentations today have been great. I was just saying to Brian, about a minute ago, everybody speaks so well. Really impressive, the amazing detail and nuance that everybody's had. My paper actually connects pretty well with some of the stuff that Ryan Miller was talking about this morning, and also what Joe Mudd had to say in his video. So I look forward to the conversation at the end. I'll jump in. So we're living in, what people call a populist age or a populist moment. Perhaps I'm wrong, but that statement strikes me as relatively non-controversial these days. Everyone seems to have an opinion about populism, but hardly anyone seems to agree on what that term means, right? What is populism, for example, a symptom of or a response to? Is it all bad, or is it all good, or is it something in between? And sort of, the further question, where do we go from here, right? Now that we find ourselves in this moment. And I think different answers to these questions reflect different, and in many cases, dialectically opposed accounts of the nature of community, power, and politics. And so what I'd like to do this afternoon is to explore the relationship between answers to these types of questions and their underlying presuppositions by initiating a conversation between Bernard Lonergan and the work of noted political theorist Chantal Mouffe. Mouffe argues that the current populist moment in Western democracies is in large part the function of contemporary neoliberalism's misguided efforts to construct a politics beyond hegemony, as she puts it. According to Mouffe, the rise of populist movements that challenge the status quo marked the reemergence of what Carl Schmitt terms the political. Schmitt's contention that political identities are collective identities whose existence is predicated upon some form of exclusion shares important features with the detailed analysis of populism developed by Mouffe's longtime collaborator, Ernesto Laclau. Laclau conceives populism as a political logic that finds expression in diverse struggles to define the people against those who hold power. Far from transcending Schmitt's friend-enemy distinction, neoliberal post-politics has inappropriately moralized it in ways that risk radicalizing right-wing populist movements that threaten the long-term stability of liberal democracy. In responding to this stalemate between competing absolutisms, Mouffe calls for two major shifts, one meta-theoretical and the other political. The first step, she says, beyond polarization requires the adoption of an agonistic pluralism that sublimates rather than denies the conflictual dimension of all politics. And then building on this first move, Mouffe contends that the principal task of the left in today's current populist moment is to construct, as she puts it, an inclusive form of the people committed to the radicalization of democratic equality. Now, I think there's a lot to like in this diagnosis of and response to our current populist moment. I'm certainly supportive of Mouffe's critical project, but also of her constructive calls to widen public debate and to cultivate a more inclusive conception of the common good. In thinking about, in the last sort of couple of months, in thinking about where to begin a conversation between Mouffe and Lonergan, I kept returning to Lonergan's reflections on the nature of power in his brief but densely argued essay in a third collection entitled The Dialectic of Authority. And Joe Mudd spoke a little bit about this during his video earlier today. Drawing on insights into the nature of cooperation, community, and the human good present elsewhere in his work, The Dialectic of Authority contains, at least as I see it, an implicit theory of populism that confirms but also enriches elements of Mouffe's work. Influenced by Mouffe's contention that Schmidt's friend-enemy distinction closely tracks or resembles René Girard's account of mimetic rivalry, my exposition of Lonergan's essay will integrate elements of Robert Doran's reflections on the Lonergan-Girard relationship. The paper, and so that's the sort of the first two pieces, and the paper will conclude by exploring Lonergan's response to what he calls the contemporary crisis of meaning, or what we might call the contemporary crisis of legitimation, if we're drawing specifically on the dialectic of authority. And my intention is not so much to challenge Mouffe's work as it is to complicate it, I think, in ways that support our own goals. And I think in some way, the combination of insights from all three authors represent, in my judgment, a modest first step towards the articulation of what we might call an inclusive populism. Okay? So that's where I'm going to go. Those are the three sort of pieces. Mouffe, something about the dialectic of authority, and then applying elements of both Mouffe's work and the dialectic of authority to, as I said, the contemporary crisis of meaning. At the heart of Mouffe's work stand two interrelated concepts, antagonism and populism. Mouffe connects her analysis of antagonism to Carl Schmitt's notion of the political. The latter refers not to a particular type of institution or a sphere of society, but rather to the constitutive role that conflict plays in the discursive construction of social orders. According to Schmitt, political identities are affectively laden collective identities that depend upon the formation of a homogeneous demos or people predicated upon some form of exclusion. This relational conception of identity underscores the impossibility of defining any we or us apart from what Derrida calls its constitutive outside, the they or other from which it is differentiated. Since the construction of every social order requires, as Mouffe puts it, the exclusion of other possibilities, Schmitt's conception of the political forecloses the possibility of what she says, describes as a perfectly reconciled and harmonious sort of society. By contrast with the political, right, sort of antagonism, politics, as a set of practices, refers to those practices and institutions which aim to constitute a particular social order in conditions that are marked by antagonism. Politics proceeds in and through practices of articulation that attempt to construct the social order by turning what Mouffe and Leclos call elements, which are sort of empty or floating signifiers whose meaning can be fixed by alternative hegemonic projects, into what they call moments within a broader discourse. Since articulations are, quote, contingent interventions taking place in an undecidable terrain, end quote, hegemonic practices that temporarily constitute the social order always reflect a particular configuration of power relations. According to Mouffe, what is at any given moment taken for granted as being natural or common sense is, as she puts it, the result of sedimented practices that conceal the originary acts of their contingent political institution. And so by uncovering the political roots of social objectivity, discourse analysis highlights how every social order is susceptible to counter-hegemonic projects. Now, Mouffe's embrace of, so that's the first sort of her take on antagonism and its relationship to the political. Mouffe's embrace of Schmitt's notion of the political is closely related to Ernesto Leclos' conception of populism. Leclos' approach depends on a distinction between two forms or types of discourse that are simultaneously present in all societies, institutionalist and populist. Roughly correlative with the established sort of social order, institutionalism is centered on addressing and absorbing democratic demands so as to secure the complicity, right, of various parties in society. By contrast, populism, on the other hand, is not a specific ideology, but rather a way of doing politics, a particular form or logic of the political that arises in diverse contexts marked by democratic deficits. And according to Leclos, populism requires a dichotomic division of society that distinguishes, as he puts it, between underdogs or outsiders and those who hold power. And for Leclos, populist subjectivity is constructed by linking these unmet democratic demands into what he calls a chain of equivalence, structured around certain floating signifiers that have been transformed into sort of affectively charged nodal points, such as the examples he gives that are typical sort of the people or workers or the nation, right? Different examples of the same sort of phenomenon. Now, Mouffe has applied these sort of reflections on the nature of the political and populism to our contemporary context in very interesting ways, at least as I see it. She conceives liberal democracy as the product of a contingent conjunction of two traditions or principles. On the one hand, she talks about liberalism's focus on individual liberty, the rule of law, and universal human rights. And on the other hand, she talks about the democratic tradition's commitments to popular sovereignty and equality. Now, according to Mouffe, the rise of neoliberal forms of individualism and rationalism have led to the erosion of those of the democratic tradition's two constitutive elements, popular sovereignty and equality. And Mouffe ties the eclipse of popular sovereignty to the rise of what she calls post-politics. Post-politics presumes that liberal democracy's triumph over communism has ushered in a world where individuals, unhindered by outmoded attachments to collective identities, can achieve a universal rational consensus. And so this vision of a world, right, that, as she says, beyond hegemony, finds expression in the policies of third-way politicians who celebrate, as she puts it, the blurring of political frontiers, right, between left and right. That is the product of a consensus at the center, right? And in the absence of viable alternatives, what's happened? Well, politics has become synonymous with management by experts of the established neoliberal order. In practice, so that's the sort of first pole of the democratic tradition that's sort of been eroded. In practice, social democracy's acquiescence to the dogma of neoliberal globalization has fueled a process that she describes of oligarchization that is responsible for the erosion of democracy's other major ideal, namely equality. So fed by increasing economic financialization and by policies of privatization, deregulation, deindustrialization, this process has contributed to an exponential growth of inequality. Now, according to Mouffe, the multiplication of these unsatisfied democratic demands has led to an interregnum, a period of crisis during which elements of the reigning neoliberal consensus have been destabilized or dislocated. And she contends that the rise of resistance to neoliberalism has led to the reactivation of the political in the Schmittian sense, right? Or to the emergence of a populist moment that pits alternative constructions of the people against the neoliberal order and each other. According to Mouffe, much of the initial resistance to the post-political consensus came from right-wing movements such as the Freedom Party of Austria and the National Front in France. In their retrieval, and they are retrieving in a sense, democratic sovereignty and equality, right-wing populists tend to construct the people in exclusivist terms and to restrict the ascription of democratic rights to ethnic and or religious in-group members. Motivated principally by fear, proponents of right-wing populism scapegoat enemies perceived to threaten the cultural integrity and economic success of the nation, including immigrants, religious minorities, and the political elites that support them. This xenophobic conception of the demos, coupled with right-wing populism's unwillingness to directly target neoliberal individualism, has aided the rise, at least as Mouffe sees it, of nationalistic authoritarian forms of neoliberalism that threaten the recovery of democracy. Now, she also contends that neoliberalism's sort of blindness to the role that collective identifications play in politics leaves its proponents particularly ill-equipped to account for or respond to the rise of movements like the one that elected Trump, right? Neoliberalism's appeal to a consensus that purportedly transcends antagonism, right, is a cover story designed to justify and perpetuate its own hegemonic status. In reality, neoliberalism operates with a moralized version of the friend-enemy distinction, that justifies branding those who dissent from liberal orthodoxy as uneducated or unreasonable and or immoral, right? And this is not unrelated to some of what Ryan was talking about this morning, and the quote from Hillary Clinton, for example. In reality, from the perspective of post-politics, the rise of right-wing populism can only be understood as an expression of irrational forces, right? Or as Mouffe puts it, a return to the archaic, destined to be overcome by the eventual triumph of neoliberal globalization. Rather than engaging opponents of the status quo, proponents of neoliberalism have chosen instead to condemn, to disqualify, and to exclude in ways that threaten to radicalize opponents of the status quo. And so for Mouffe, at least, this sort of cycle of mutual recrimination has reduced politics, in a sense, to a clash between competing forms of essentialism or absolutism. Something about her sort of response to this. She argues that the first step, and it's a sort of two-part sort of response she has to this problematic. She argues that the first step in overcoming this sort of moralized stalemate between competing absolutisms is to develop an alternative account of politics that provides an outlet for distinctive political identities, right? That broadens sort of discourse. Unlike Schmitt, who believes that the liberal and democratic traditions are mutually exclusive, Mouffe argues that it remains possible to think with Schmitt beyond Schmitt, as she puts it, and to construct the people in ways that remain compatible with liberalism's commitment to pluralism. The goal is not to evade the antagonism constitutive of the political, but rather to sublimate conflict in ways that enable an alternative account of the we-they relationship, the us-them relationship. At the heart of Mouffe's efforts to transcend Schmitt's friend-enemy relation lies her distinction between what she will call antagonism and agonism. Whereas the former names a we-they relation in which the parties lack any common bond, and hence treat their opponents as enemies essentially to be eradicated, the latter, agonism, refers to a conflict where the two sides treat each other as adversaries. Members of the same political association, adversaries inhabit, as she puts it, a common symbolic space structured by what she describes as a conflictual consensus, right? A conflictual consensus that is rooted in a shared commitment to, as she puts it, the ethico-political values of liberty and equality for all. Like other empty signifiers, and they're empty signifiers for her, the meanings of these principles are temporarily stabilized by different discursive practices. The latter are partial fixations in an undecidable terrain, which can be disarticulated and transformed in and through agonistic contest. Adversaries, in a sense, disagree fiercely in many cases as to the meaning and implementation of these principles, liberty and equality for all, but they do not necessarily question their opponent's right to defend and advance their own ideas. The competition between alternative hegemonic projects that marks Mouffe's adversarial model of politics is played out, at least for her, on the left-right axis within society. That's the first part of her response, right? So, and sort of building on what she says around this move towards an agonistic pluralism, she talks about this move towards a left populist sort of vision. So, you know, agonism is in a sense compatible with a broad range of options, right? It's, as an analytic theory, it's compatible with all sorts of different projects, and at the same time, it sets for Mouffe important conditions of possibility for her own political project, a left populism that she terms radical democracy. Mouffe is critical of the center-left's capitulation to neoliberal globalization and its related efforts to incrementally reform the status quo, but also of the revolutionary left's call to abandon liberal democracy entirely. By contrast with both approaches, Mouffe calls for the radicalization, quote, of existing democratic institutions so as to make the principles of liberty and equality become effective in an increasing number of social relations, end quote. By contrast with various forms of Marxist essentialism that privilege class struggle and or that deny the need for concrete political organization, Mouffe claims that the best way to effect real change is to adopt a left populist strategy. The latter focuses on constructing a collective we or people that defines itself in opposition to a common adversary, the oligarchy. According to Mouffe, this left populist conception of the people is a discursive construction that is the product, again, of a chain of equivalence that connects heterogeneous democratic demands. Commitment to a radical democratic conception of citizenship that unites agents fighting against diverse forms of oppression is achieved through the cultivation, as she puts it, of a different regime of affects and desires that support, in a sense, identification with radical democracy. Mouffe's hope is that this approach will attract voters currently aligned with right-wing populist parties who lack an alternative way to articulate their unsatisfied demands. So, shifting now to sort of just to say a little bit about that, her approach, and then to the Lonergan piece. As I mentioned, I think at the outset, I think there's much to like in Mouffe's diagnosis of and response to our current populist moment, and we can have that out at the end, I guess. If you disagree, that's fine. In her efforts to articulate, I think, an agonistic theory of democracy that avoids both pejorative forms of secularism and the rebirth of anti-liberal forms of traditionalism, Mouffe's work points the way towards what we might call a benign form of secularization, compatible with real diversity. At the same time, her call for the construction of a left populism committed to, as she puts it, the radicalization, right, of the principles of liberty and equality for all, strikes me as an essential component in the construction of a more inclusive common good. That being said, I'm curious about Mouffe's account of how and why individuals move from Schmitt's strong form of exclusion to an agonistic conception of politics, and from agonism to a radical democratic identity in particular. According to Mouffe, both shifts require like a radical change in political identity, as she puts it, that are less the consequence of any sort of process of rational persuasion and more the result of what she terms conversion. Interesting sort of choice of words. In the background here lies Mouffe's anti-essentialist conception of the subject, breaking with liberalism's picture of the social agent as a unified, homogeneous entity. Mouffe conceives the subject as a plurality, whose identity is, as she puts it, dependent on the various subject positions through which it is constituted within various discursive formations, end quote. In responding to criticisms of this decentered account of subjectivity, Leclos, her colleague, draws a further distinction between subject positions that are the product of identification and the subject who emerges in and through what he describes as the moment of decision. According to Leclos, the subject constitutes or self-determines herself through a decision made in partially regulated but ultimately undecidable terrain. Although Leclos claims that the passage from, as he puts it, structural undecidability to decision lacks any ethical grounding, perhaps more can be said. And that's where I think Lonergan's dialectic of authority comes in. So the second part. The dialectic of authority, in a sense, unfolds in two major parts, at least as I see it. In the first, Lonergan develops a heuristic account of power and authority that confirms features of Mouffe's approach to politics. In the second, he conceives the dialectic of authority as a dialectic of contradictories that distinguishes between legitimate and illegitimate power, a distinction not present in Mouffe's work that Lonergan explores in dialogue with the dialectic of history. Prompted by Mouffe's own reference to the connection, as I said at the beginning, between Schmitt and Girard, my exposition of Lonergan's essay will integrate elements of Doran's reflections on the Lonergan-Girard relationship. And then the final section of the paper, as I said, I'll bring both of these authors' work, all three of their authors' work, into dialogue with, as I put it, the contemporary crisis of meaning. So something about Lonergan's sort of heuristic account of power and authority in that essay. It hinges on really on three main claims. First, the source of power is cooperation, and I'm going to unpack all three of them. Second, the carrier of power is the community. And third, power in the world mediated by meaning resides in, as Lonergan puts it, in the word of authority. Okay? So according to Lonergan, cooperation, right, is both diachronic and synchronic in nature, right? First, we can talk about cooperation, as he puts it, down the ages. And cooperation down the ages highlights the way in which achievements of the past are accumulated, developed, and integrated, as he puts it, by successive generations through a complex process of socialization, roughly correlative with the sort of sociological meaning of what the later Lonergan describes as development from above. This division of labor, as Lonergan puts it, in the acquisition and development of knowledge is a function of what he elsewhere terms belief, right, or secondhand knowing. Second, besides cooperation down the ages, right, there is cooperation at any given time and place, right? shaped and informed by the mediation of past developments, this synchronic conception of cooperation in the here and now is roughly correlative with those institutional frameworks constituted of what Lonergan terms the good of order. Okay? That's the first part. If cooperation is the source of power, Lonergan argues that the community that transmits the discoveries and inventions of the past and that cooperates in the present is the carrier of power. According to Lonergan, a community is something more than simply a collection of people who share geographical boundaries, right? Rather, community, the collective subject referred to by we, us, ourselves, exists only where individuals, as Lonergan puts it, share a common field of experience with a common or at least complementary way of understanding people and things with common judgments and common aims, end quote. Elsewhere, Lonergan articulates the various elements constitutive of communal or collective consciousness by distinguishing between three interrelated forms of belonging: primitive or intersubjective, civil, and cultural, correlative with particular goods, the good of order, and terminal values, respectively. Lonergan's distinction between two ways of being conscious can, at least as I see it, help us differentiate between, on the one hand, primitive, and on the other, civil and cultural dimensions of communion. According to Lonergan, humans are conscious in one way through our sensibility, insofar as we, quote, undergo rather passively what we sense and imagine, our desires and sorrows, our joys and sadness, end quote. Robert Dorn correlates this first way of being conscious with the sensitive psychic dimension of consciousness, constituted by the subject's, quote, sensations, memories, images, emotions, conations, associations, bodily movements, and spontaneous intersubjective responses, end quote. The latter include those spontaneous pro-social emotions or feelings of belonging together that motivate elementary, or what we might call primordial, forms of cooperation and community. Now, Dorn connects Lonergan's account of intersubjectivity with René Girard's reflections on the mimetic or triangular nature of human desire. By contrast with the romantic lie that conceives human desire as autonomous or self-selected, Girard contends that desire is elicited or mediated by models that individuals mimic or imitate. Unlike Girard, however, Lonergan argues that we are also conscious in a second and more active way. By sublating the sensitive psychic dimension of human consciousness, the subject's non-elicited spiritual desire for intelligibility, knowledge, and value ushers her out of the world of immediacy and into the world mediated by meaning. At the same time, the subject's intersubjective spontaneity permeates, it underpins, it accompanies, and overarches the subject's orientation to self-transcendence, right? And as Robert Dorn has said in many places, right, the negotiation of this coincidental manifold is itself a function of the second way of being conscious. Right? This development of human intellectuality conditions the possibility of civil and cultural dimensions of community. Over time, the development of practical intelligence gives rise to what Lonergan terms the good of order, right? Those patterns of cooperation constitutive of civil society or community that condition the recurrent distribution of particular goods. If these institutional frameworks constitute the community's way of life, culture, by contrast, refers to, as Lonergan puts it, the complex web of meanings and values which may make a way of life worth living and a society worth belonging to, end quote. Lonergan draws a further distinction between an everyday or common sense level of meanings and values implicit in social practices and a reflexive or superstructural level of culture wherein the meanings and values implicit in everyday living are objectified and evaluated. So that's the first two steps in this heuristic account of power that Lonergan is articulating. The third, finally, Lonergan argues that power in the world mediated by meaning resides in what he terms the word of authority. All right? The latter is roughly correlative, as he puts it in the Dialectic of Authority, with the sum total of current institutions, where institutions is used in the broadest sense to refer to those commonly understood and accepted patterns of cooperation constitutive of a distinctive community. As Lonergan puts it, these are the sort of the product of use and want, right? This word is responsible for mediating past achievements through a complex process of socialization, but also for directing cooperation in the present. Right? Just as the word of authority sets the lines among which cooperation occurs, it also bans or excludes from social intercourse those who disrupt the cooperating society. Okay? That's the sort of heuristic picture that I think he's developing in the beginning of that lecture. Something about the dialectic of authority, right? More properly, I think it adds to this heuristic account of cooperation and community a further distinction, as I put it, between legitimate and illegitimate power that complicates Leclos and Mouffe's institutionalist populist distinction. More specifically, Lonergan argues that if authenticity, right, confers on power the aura and prestige of authority, inauthenticity leaves, as he puts it, power naked, or reveals it as mere power, right? This dialectic of contradictories finds expression in three different but interrelated carriers, as he puts it. First, there's the community or tradition, whose word of authority is a function of past and present cooperation. Second, there are those individuals who are delegated as authorities by the wider community. Right? Joe Mudd spoke a little bit about that earlier today. Right? And then third, there are those individuals who are both socialized into the broader community, and who are responsible for appointing the authorities in that community. Right? As Lonergan says in the essay, right? He puts it, inquiry into the legitimacy of authority or authorities is complex and ultimately often inconclusive. And so he adopts what he calls a more synthetic viewpoint. It's a short essay, right? And he's really focused on connections between the dialectics of authority and history towards the end of that essay. Whereas the fruit of authenticity is communal harmony and progress in human history, the fruit of inauthenticity is communal breakdown and decline. Lonergan describes the way in which inauthentic subjects appoint inauthentic authorities who favor some groups over others, right? And this favoritism, itself a function of group and general bias, contributes to the breakdown of cooperation and to a seesaw battle, as he puts it, between different groups fighting to gain the upper hand in society. In his own exploration of the Lonergan-Girard relationship, Dorn connects these distorted forms of intersubjectivity with Girard's account of mimetic rivalry and violence. According to Girard, the rise of conflictual forms of mimesis contribute to the emergence of friend-enemy dynamics that culminate in a sacrificial crisis. The latter is resolved in and through what Girard terms the single victim or scapegoat mechanism, right? That restores unity to the community via the murder or expulsion of an individual or group. Girard's reflections on the nature of what he terms sacrificial religion identify dynamics that mark right-wing forms of Christian populism, but also contemporary neoliberalism. Far from overcoming sacrificial religion, secularism, right, in the pejorative sense, has fostered a migration of the false sacred from religion to the state and market. The latter function, right, as sort of catechons, right, structures that hold back violence through violence by unifying otherwise disconnected individuals against internal and external enemies. Since the application of intelligence to the unintelligible situation, right, that is the product of sustained inauthenticity, yields ultimately nothing, right? Lonergan argues that development from below must be complemented by the redemptive effects of self-sacrificial love. The latter conditions the possibility, as he puts it, of a community of love capable of healing those distortions of intersubjectivity that lie at the root of social antagonisms, and of correcting those objective absurdities that are the product of inauthenticity. Roughly correlative with fidelity to what Lonergan elsewhere terms the law of the cross, Dorn connects this account of redemption with Girard's reflections on biblical revelation. According to Girard, Jesus' renunciation of mimetic rivalry exposes and dismantles the scapegoat mechanism and simultaneously reveals the possibility of a positive form of mimesis, captured by his invitation to sort of be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect, end quote. All right. At the end of his essay, so he's talked now about the dialectic of authority, he's brought it into dialogue with the dialectic of history. At the end of his essay, Lonergan complicates this basic account of the relationship between those two dialectics by connecting decline, progress, and redemption with two currents that mark all social orders, right? Very similar to the way in which Mouffe and Leclos do, the organizational and the mystical or the ideal, as Lonergan puts it. Now, the former, the organizational current, focuses on defending and perpetuating the established word of authority, while the latter, right, the mystical or ideal, focuses on identifying and reversing the limitations and deficiencies that mark the present state of affairs. Lonergan, he teases out the interplay of these two currents in human history towards the end of that essay by appealing to Arnold Toynbee's ideal types, right, including creative and dominant minorities, the internal and external proletariat, and universal religion, right, categories that show up in other places in his work as well. According to Lonergan, the creative minority are the representatives of progress, right, whose leaders, as he puts it, gain the adhesion of the masses by successfully meeting the challenge of each successive situation, end quote. The shift from a creative to, as Lonergan puts it, a merely dominant minority is a function of the former's decreasing ability to address or respond to the emergence of new social challenges and problems. This desire to remain in the saddle contributes to the emergence of both an internal and external proletariat that challenge the status quo. The former, right, the internal proletariat, refers to, as Lonergan puts it, the increasingly disaffected and disillusioned masses internal to a given community, whereas the latter, the external proletariat, refers to outsiders who, as Lonergan puts it, have discovered the weaknesses of their neighbor. Lonergan argues that an authentic negotiation of the crisis precipitated by these failures depends at least in part upon the reemergence of a creative minority capable of mobilizing the proletariat. If the proximate source of social progress is personal authenticity, right, the source of authentic cultures, institutions, and authorities, its remote source is grounded in what Toynbee terms universal religion. In his description of the latter, Lonergan argues that religion should focus less on, as he puts it, issuing commands and decrees, love that line, and more on cultivating the self-sacrificial love essential to reversing communal breakdown and decline. Okay, that's the first two pieces. I have a few more minutes, and I'm going to pivot now and say something about how I sort of try to bring this all together in a sense. And this is probably the most schematic piece of what I've said so far. Okay, so drawing on elements of Lonergan's dialectic of authority and what little time I have left, I'd like to explore connections between his response to the contemporary crisis of meaning and Mouffe's constructive proposals. Okay, and so roughly correlative with what Lonergan describes as the scattered left or the secularization to be resisted, proponents of the neoliberal order constitute a dominant minority whose taken for granted authority has been problematized by a variety of interrelated crises. Neoliberalism's anti-populist response to its own dislocation has fueled the return of the false sacred, correlative with what Lonergan terms the solid right, or the secularization to be rejected. Adapting Schmidt's claim that liberal pluralism and democratic equality are mutually exclusive, some Christians have embraced exclusivist conceptions of racial, national, and religious identity that scapegoat non-whites, especially refugees and Muslims, and the liberal elites who support them. In line with Mouffe's own critique, right-wing Christian populists' unwillingness to directly target neoliberal presuppositions has contributed to the rise of nationalist forms of neoliberalism that remain complicit in the longer cycle of decline. These openly xenophobic forms of individualism underlie right-wing populism's support of Trump, but also its visceral distaste for Pope Francis, whose call for a culture of dialogue and focus on accompaniment read as accommodations to globalism and relativism, respectively. According to Mouffe, the conversion, right, from these two variations of antagonism, right, it's a sort of stalemate between these two sort of extremes, to an agonistic form of politics is at least in part the result of what she describes as the dissolution of the markers of certainty. And from the perspective of Laclau's subject, the adoption of an agonistic approach to politics might be understood as like a pragmatic compromise that functions in sort of cataclysmic ways to hold back violence. But my question is, like, is a shared commitment to nonviolent struggle over the meaning of liberty and equality, terms that are themselves empty of all positive content, is that strong enough to sustain the bonds that agonism seems to require? Girard would likely say no. I think the rise of integralism and illiberalism more broadly seems to confirm his hunch. One way of strengthening Mouffe's case for an agonistic pluralism is to focus on Lonergan's unique response to what he terms the contemporary crisis of meaning. Lonergan hints at the distinctiveness of this particular crisis in the dialectic of authority by distinguishing between the legitimacy of authority and the validation of that legitimacy in and through methods of legitimation. Although Lonergan agrees that all communities require some, as he puts it, external form of legitimation, he also notes that these standards are insufficient insofar as they prescind from assessing the relative authenticity of the traditions that are their source. From this perspective, the relativization of all external standards, that is a function of classical culture's breakdown, may be correlated with what Mouffe terms the recognition of structural undecidability. The deconstruction of moralized accounts of the we-they relationship found in both the scattered left and the solid right precipitates a search for an alternative control of meaning compatible with cultural and religious diversity. Unlike Leclos' subject, right, whose decisions made in undecidable terrain resemble, as he put it, madness, right? Lonergan's negotiation of the modern turn to the subject is designed to elicit transcultural norms compatible with what Alistair McIntyre calls tradition-dependent rationality. According to Lonergan, a fully critical response to the contemporary crisis of meaning requires a process of cognitive and existential self-appropriation, whereby individuals take open-eyed control of their conscious intentional striving. Self-appropriation shifts the control of meaning from those discursively mediated meanings, values, and desires that Mouffe and Girard tend to take for granted to the subject's desire for knowledge and value that is both source and norm of discursive practices in their ongoing revision. Occupying what Lonergan interventions of meaning terms the not numerous center, a creative minority of individuals who have achieved intellectual conversion can play an integral role in furthering Mouffe's own constructive proposals in at least three ways, and this is sort of the bridge to the very end. First, self-appropriation's differentiation of the subject's desire for knowledge and value from those categorical determinations constitutive of distinctive hegemonic projects can further deepen Mouffe's account of the conflictual consensus, right, that marks liberal democracy as she sees it. Knowledge or truth and value or goodness are not merely empty signifiers whose content is partially fixed in different ways by alternative hegemonic projects, but also heuristic notions that anticipate and guide the ongoing search for and determination of that content. Reference to humankind's shared desire for knowledge and value yields a heuristic form of metaphysics capable of generating an overlapping consensus, an alternative thin we or inclusive conception of community compatible with conflicting political projects. By specifying tradition transcendental norms that structure reason exchange within and between different traditions, Lonergan's emphasis on self-appropriation sets important conditions of possibility for an agonistic politics roughly correlative with the secularization, with the secularization to be welcomed. This modified form of agonism closely resembles McIntyre's efforts to avoid both relativism and objectivism or classicism and what he terms the rationality of traditions, right? McIntyre's account of the way, in fact, in which communities negotiate epistemological crises via immanent critique has the potential to enrich Mouffe's account of destabilization and the contestation that it stimulates. That's the first. Second, and then the third very quickly. Third, the distinction between legitimate and illegitimate power that is a function of self-appropriation can also provide a basis for navigating the nature of liberal democracy itself. Elsewhere, I've developed a two-level account of liberal democratic norms that distinguishes between remote and proximate elements. The former refers to the subject as source and norm of human rights theory and praxis, and the latter to various contingent political projects that define the meaning and implementation of liberty and equality for all in different ways. Reference to the remote source of liberal democratic norms in human consciousness provides a criterion for evaluating the relative authenticity of various efforts to fix the meaning of liberty and equality in determinate ways. Infidelity to the subject's orientation to knowledge and value finds expression in, for example, sacrificial religion, as well as in secularized variations of the false sacred that are roughly correlative, as I said, with what Lonergan terms the solid right and scattered left, respectively. In my development of Lonergan's work, I link human dignity with the subject's orientation to self-transcendence and conceive human rights as contingent thematizations of Lonergan's thin account of the good that sustain and support the shared search for truth and value. Both of Mouffe's constructive proposals may be interpreted along these lines. Agonism supports the shared search for truth and value and freedom and dialogue by expanding the range of voices in democratic debate. On the other hand, radical democracy expands agonism's concern for civil political liberties by aiming at the construction of a more inclusive form of the common good. That's the second. Third, very quickly, and then I now have like a minute. Third, Lonergan's more differentiated account of the subject can provide tools for the interrogation of contemporary forms of left populism. Since left populism functions as an empty signifier, not all expressions of so-called left populist politics will be authentically progressive. In his recent work, Angus Ritchie distinguishes between what he calls fake populism, present on both right and left ends of the spectrum, and what he terms inclusive populism, the latter which closely resembles the vision I have developed above. Fake left populists reproduce sacrificial dynamics by scapegoating their enemies, including neoliberals, religious believers, and whoever else might fail the cultural left's progressive tests. Ironically, fake left populism distorted conception of inclusion marginalizes large segments of the population it purports to assist in ways that fuel the rise of right-wing reactionism. And here's the concluding paragraph. I appreciate your patience. Finally, if self-appropriation sets important conditions of possibility for both agonism and radical democracy, these conditions are insufficient for guaranteeing the consistent authenticity that both projects demand. In other words, the vision of democratic health that the human spirit at its best commends is one thing, and fidelity to that vision is another. Notwithstanding her efforts to move beyond sacrificial forms of identity, Mouffe does not refer to Girard's own efforts to transcend the false sacred. According to Dorn, fidelity to the law of the cross, itself a function of positive mimesis, conditions the birth of, as he puts it, right, a new social reality, a community of friendship with the three divine persons and among ourselves. The experience of vertical communion with the three divine persons grounds in expansion of fellow feeling or spontaneous intersubjectivity that finds expression at the horizontal level of human living in what Dorn terms social grace. Social grace foregrounds the way in which the universal gift of God's love conditions the possibility of an integral functioning of the scale of values, and more specifically of those cultural and social values that ensure an equitable distribution of primary goods. This new form of interdividuation is essential to the development of a progressive chain of equivalence that unifies diverse protest movements while avoiding the tendency to demonize those who hold power. Far from underwriting exclusionary politics, the real or genuine sacred's focus on self-sacrificing love, what Lonergan elsewhere terms the sacralization to be fostered, conditions the possibility of an authentically inclusive common good. And I'm going to leave it there. I apologize for going 2 minutes over.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful.
Thank you for listening for so long. I apologize.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Oh, it looks like we already have a question. So we'll jump right in. We can either, I'll have people, if you can either raise your hand or you can use the chat function. So Ryan, you can take it away.
Hooray. Yeah, thanks so much for that, Nick. I mean, you know this, but I should preface my question by saying, so I heard an earlier version of this paper because Nick and I were on a panel in Vancouver last summer. He hadn't added the Girardian and dialectic authority components yet. And I just had, I'm curious what your take is on something. I think it might even intensify the urgency of what you're talking about. So obviously, relative to the Girard, there's the old scapegoating mechanism, which is present in sacrificial religion and the problematics of community where a scapegoat is expelled, usually arbitrarily to get rid of the tension built up by acquisitive mimesis and rivalry and violence and different things. And depending on where you're talking about in Girard, he'll point out that sometimes those victims didn't do anything wrong, sometimes they have, but that mechanism is unmasked by Christ as the truly blameless victim. For those of us who've read Girard, we all know this, so I'm not going to restate it over and over again. But something just clicked for me that's interesting, because what's been bothering me lately in reference to the Trump administration and what sure seems to be a ramp up to, regardless of what happens with the election, and it's already starting, the discussion of a rigged election or things like that. And Trump's discussion about how no president's ever been treated more unfairly than he has. While you were talking about the dialectic of authority in relation to Girard, I wonder if there isn't an even deeper perversion going on right now, not just the old scapegoating mechanism, but something like a warping of the unmasked scapegoating mechanism, which I think might even be like a doubling down on the false sacralization, where that which has been unmasked, which I think that unmasking has had an impact on the culture broadly, because Christianity's had effects, authentic religion, the law of the cross is operative in secular culture, has fostered that authentic secularization and authentic sacralization. I wonder if there isn't a certain sense in which there's a darker false sacralization of an idolatrous scapegoating mechanism, which maps onto power as opposed to authority, that's taken root in a new way as the result of sort of the intensifications of polarization and the intensifications of the emboldening of the hard and fast right and the scattered left that you were talking about. This seems like a new development to me, and I don't like using this word because I think using it too much cheapens it, but it strikes me as satanic. The sort of cult of Trump as scapegoat and victim and almost Christ figure in that regard. Do you have any thoughts about that? Because it really sort of hit me in between the eyes while you were talking about it, because I hadn't heard you mention the Girard or the Dorn in relation to this, and it clicked for me in ways that I hadn't had happened before.
I mean, there's a lot there, Brian.
Yeah, sorry.
No.
I got excited while you were talking, man. You always do this to me.
And it was all really well said. And I mean, I have to admit, I'm not an expert in Girard. Like, I really came to Girard in and through Dorn's work, through Bob's work.
I think Bob does a very good job summarizing Girard, in fairness. So,
yeah, I mean, it's super helpful for me. And I think, I think the sort of neoliberal sort of order that for me, that's a very clear sort of migration, as sort of like William Kavanaugh would say, that sort of we've seen a migration of the holy from the church to the state and the nation, and that's really just a transposition really of the false sacred. But then when you start thinking about Trump, yeah, I mean that as a movement, there's all sorts of friend-enemy dynamics that are going on there. But I'm hearing you say something more about how he's also, and his followers in some sense, have put him up as this victim as well. Right?
Yeah.
There's that other element that's going on. To be honest, I haven't really even thought of that, but that's so
I
obvious.
hadn't either. And yeah.
It's so obvious now that you say it.
Well, you did it. You occasioned it.
I mean, it seems very obvious now that you say it. I mean, I think it only feeds into the sort of scapegoating that sort of right-wing populists are trading in, right? I mean, it solidifies, I think, opposition to, whoever is standing in their way, really, in a sense. I don't know. Others might want to jump in on this. I think it's a great question. I'd have to think about that some more.
Yeah, so do I.
Yeah, so thank you, Brian, for that. We'll go over to Murray. So Murray, you can take the floor now for your question.
Thanks for the talk. I had one really brief question. Earlier on, you quoted from the dialect of authority, where you spoke of complementary ways of understanding people and things. I remember reading that passage, and I read it against the background of the 1957 lectures on existentialism, where Lonergan speaks of, he speaks of a disruption in the way in which we interact with the Mitwelt of persons and the Umwelt of things. So I found it striking. He was using similar language. And then at that point, he was speaking of sort of a disruption in the concrete synthesis of successful living in those earlier lectures. Then he placed that within the context of conversion. And it seems when he speaks of conversion in those lectures, the emphasis is different, say, when he speaks of intellectual, moral, or religious conversion. So here was my quick comment. How would you describe the relationship between that sense of conversion in those lectures and Mouffe's conception of conversion, which you sort of drew attention to on 2 occasions in your talk? You said it was striking that she used the word conversion. So I was wondering if you could fit together a little bit Mouffe's use of the word and Lonergan's use of the word, specifically in relationship to disruption.
Yeah, I mean, so Murray, thanks for the question. I mean, it's a good question, and I mean, I'm drawing a complete blank as to those lectures that you're speaking of.
Okay.
So if you want to tell me a little bit more what you mean by disruption there, I mean, I could take a stab at it, or I could just talk about conversion in a general sense in terms of Mouffe.
Actually, I think I would much prefer to hear you.
Sure. I mean, she uses that term. I mean, I can say a little bit about the way, a little bit more about the way in which Mouffe uses that term, and the way in which I think it connects to what Lonergan is up to. I think in the dialectic of authority. Yeah, I mean, for her, right? Like, there's really no basis for why. There's no rational argument that one might make for why I should adopt, for example, why I should move from a sort of friend-enemy sort of dichotomy towards an agonistic sort of understanding of pluralism. And there's really no, again, rational explanation for why one would adopt a like a progressive form of left populism that tries to radicalize, as she puts it, liberty and equality for all. There's really no explanation for either of those, right? And Leclos, I think she was, in their earlier work on hegemony and sort of socialist strategy, they were critiqued after that book came out for not really having any real account of the subject, right? I mean, they had sort of reduced everything to sort of subject positions that were the product of identifications within discursive practices. And Leclos, sort of in response to that, came up with this distinction between the subject and the sort of the subject's positions within distinctive sort of discourses. And I was sort of struck by that. I mean, I think what he's trying to do is avoid a sort of an enlightenment return to sort of the subject, and I don't know if they're willing or able to sort of speak about some middle ground that doesn't conceive the subject in sort of in classicist terms, for example, and so when she uses the term conversion, I think what she's saying is 2 things. The movement from antagonism to agonism, I think for her, is facilitated by recognizing that everything is contingent. Everything is contingent, right? Like it's a sort of structural undecidability. And in coming to terms with that, we should recognize that it's better to not kill each other and to sort of just get along. Do you know what I mean? I think that's kind of the argument that she's sort of trying to make there in the background. And I think that goes very well, at least as I see it, with Lonergan's response to the crisis of meaning. And I would correlate that with intellectual conversion. And at least as I see it. And then as she describes this movement from just being open to the possibility of not wanting to kill the other person. And I think, agonism by itself doesn't really cut it. Right? Lots of people can play the game until they're close enough to power to go and grab it. Do you know what I mean? Which I think is what we're sort of seeing now in many different contexts. And so agonism on itself doesn't really cut it. I think agonism and radical democracy need to go together for them to be really sort of authentically sort of understood. And I think for her, when she talks about the shift from just being an agonistic sort of pluralist to adopting a sort of progressive sort of chain of equivalence, she's talking about specifically a new regime of desires and affects, right? That there's some form of transformation of our affectivity that is required in order for us to identify with that project, with that particular political project. And so I mean, I tried to correlate that with what we might call, psychic conversion and or religious conversion, and the way in which those 2 things are interrelated. And in one sense, because religious conversion is so basic to even intellectual conversion, I would argue that you can't really, to be a real authentically agonistic sort of pluralist, you have to already bought into radical democracy in a progressive sense. I don't know. So that's one way to think about the relationship between them on that term conversion and the relationship among the conversions in Lonergan. I don't know if that helps, Marie.
It helps quite a bit. Thanks so much.
Well, thanks for the question.
Thank you, Murray and Nick. It looks like we've got another question from Professor Byrne. Please take it away. The comments have been fascinating.
Nick, thanks for the really sweeping presentation. I can see that there's a book project behind that, and I think we're all anxious to see that forthcoming. I have a question and a semi-question. The question is, how I'm familiar a little bit with Carl Schmitt. I'm familiar a little bit with Girard. I'm not familiar with Mouffe at all. So this is just a question for understanding. I simply do not understand how her idea of democratic and agonism,
yep.
If I got that right,
yep.
Escapes her own criticism of liberal democracy. Why is this? And I think you're absolutely right. From what you described, I cannot see how her way of talking about a commitment to liberty and equality on the part of contending groups, especially when I look across the political landscape of the United States right now, I can't see how that would not function as a cover story. And the fact that it's so vacuous makes it, I'm a great fan of Barack Obama as a human being. He was a great president, but he got elected by one word, change.
Yeah.
That's about as vacuous as you can get. It means everything to everybody. And I just don't see how what Mouffe has in mind doesn't function that way and therefore become just another ideology. I wonder, as you do, about the practicality of it, but I just wonder about the theoretical dimension of it. And I wonder if you could speak to that. The other thing is, I wonder if you, I wonder if you've gotten to the depths of what goes on in the dialectic of authority. So Mouffe, it seems to me, is simply a modernist political thinker. Now, I could be wrong about that because all I know about her is what I heard in the past hour. But the modern political horizon abandoned the classical commitment that the best regime is the regime ruled by wisdom. For Lonergan, that means the best regime is a regime ruled by authenticity. And Lonergan, in the dialectic of authority, recognizes very clearly that you don't have pure authenticity in the establishment of power, community, authority, and so on. So he's got an understanding of conflict that's built into his account of power and authority, and yet the dialectic for him is not a dialectic of sort of arbitrary exercises of free will, but it's a dialectic of authenticity, which is his, I think, transposition of the classical notion of wisdom. And so I just wonder if you're engaging these contemporary figures, you might want to draw upon that, what I think is a deeper dimension. In the chapter in Dialectics and Method and Theology, Lonergan admits there are many different kinds of conflict, and not all of them are traceable to conversion.
Mm-hmm.
And I just find myself wondering, is Mouffe herself in a counterposition with regard to wisdom, with regard to what Lonergan would understand by authenticity as a basis for political legitimacy and organization?
Yeah, really good questions. And I really like how somebody asked about Mouffe. I don't know, I've been sort of enthralled with her work. Ernesto Leclos' On Populist Reason is a really interesting book. And anyways, yeah, I mean, the two sort of questions. I think there's a clear counterposition in her sort of rejection of, sort of this idea, the classical ideal of sort of the best regime, right? One that is, at least in a Lonerganian sense, connected to authenticity versus inauthenticity. And I think it's connected again to her. She also wants to say, in a sense, that not all differences are dialectical, right? She gets that much. She gets as much as to admit that, not all differences, whether cultural, et cetera, are all bad, but she really has no further control of meaning to be able to differentiate in a deeper sort of way between different sort of contingent projects. Although if she was pressed, I mean, she would say, I think she would say, from her perspective, the best regime, it would be a left populist regime that radicalizes liberty and equality for all. I think if she was pressed, though, she would have to say, kind of like, Richard Rorty would, that, I mean, that's just my opinion. You know what I mean? I can't say much more than that. And so in one sense, I think there is a counterposition there. She's lacking some tools, in a sense, to be able to say something further that Lonergan, I think, can contribute with the dialectic of authority. But I also think that there are openings in her work towards, reversal there into development. And, the original question you had asked, Pat, another really good question around, liberty and equality for all as sort of empty signifiers. Yeah, I mean, she's so against deliberative democracy as a model, right? Like, she really wants to say that there is no such thing as consensus whatsoever. But then her entire model, right, of agonistic pluralism depends on a form of consensus, right? Namely, that we're committed to these principles, but ultimately the principles are empty. They're empty signifiers, as you said, right? And so they can be conceived and constructed in very different ways. And I've been puzzled by this point because in various places she's asked this question. She says, well, even the agonistic pluralist has to say at a certain point there are enemies. We have to exclude certain people. That's the way she sort of puts it, so that we can only recognize others as our adversaries that we don't want to necessarily sort of kill in the extreme sense. But then there always has to be a further outside, right? And she's sort of asked, well, like, where's the limit for right-wing populism, for example? Do you know what I mean? Because somebody like Trump and, or other right-wing populist movements, say, for example, in Central Europe, want to say they're committed to liberty and equality for all, but they've restricted the ascription of those rights to sort of in-group members. And when she's pressed on that point, she kind of waffles. She doesn't really know what to say, right? I think what she wants to say is, well, they should, that's not compatible with what it means to sort of live and sort of, struggle over the meaning of liberal democracy, but she can't. So I don't know if any of that helps, Pat. Or not. Oh, you're on mute. Sorry, Pat.
Thanks. There's a lot there it's a big project. There's a lot further to look at.
Most definitely.
Great. Thank you, Professor Byrne and Nick. Oh, Father Doran, you take the floor.
Oh, I think you're on mute, Bob.
You're muted, Father Doran.
There we go. Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
You got me now. Okay. And I was at Regis College, the old Regis College in Toronto in '74 when Dialectic of Authority, Lonergan received off prints of it. So he met me in the corridor and he was holding these. So he gave me one of these off prints. And all he said was, there's a lot of mythic consciousness about this issue. And I said, would you care to explain what you mean by that? And he said, just read it and see what you come up with. I'm still trying to figure out exactly what he meant by mythic consciousness around the notion of authority. Any help that anybody might have on that? What might he have meant by that question?
It's a great question. Brian actually just mentioned that to me. He texted me right before I started speaking, and he relayed that anecdote.
Oh, really?
That is a true story. Nick and I have been texting all day, and I brought that up.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm trying to think. Does the term itself, does the phrase itself show up in the lecture, or he's just hinting
No.
at something like a?
No, that's not.
It doesn't. Yeah.
No. Anyway, I just throw that out there as a question for long range interpretation. Anyway, this is really good stuff that you're doing. It's really good.
I appreciate it, Bob. You're very kind. This is the most I've been dressed up since March as well.
Steve, it looks like we've got a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. This is great. Forgive me if you ended up touching on this and I just missed it, but could you talk a little bit about kind of cosmopolis and how that might fit into or add to the possibilities that Mouffe is talking about as, I'm thinking especially agonism, but also radical democracy, and what role cosmopolis might play, and if she kind of has a similar conception that would back up the possibility of these things, or if that might be an addition that Lonergan could add.
Yeah, I mean, great question. Great question. So there's an anecdote here. I think it was Joseph Ogbenai who said to me at one point, just don't talk about cosmopolis, because nobody knows what Lonergan means by that, really. And I don't think it showed up in my dissertation either. But yeah, I mean, yeah. So some new, alternative higher level control of meaning, some form of critical culture, I think is essential to an authentic form of agonistic pluralism, for sure. I don't think you can have an authentic form of agonistic pluralism without something that is approaching what Mouffe might call a sort of radical form of democracy. And for me, at least, that's another way of saying that, we're not really going to have real, genuine sort of exchanges in sort of public square absent religious conversion as well. You know what I mean? That cosmopolis, is tied to self-appropriation in a very clear way, I think, but that's only a sort of necessary condition for that, right? That it's a necessary condition for like an ethic of mutuality, but that you require something more than that. And I think Mouffe is hinting at maybe that distinction, right? When she's talking about being open to the other as a sort of bare minimum for political discourse in a liberal democracy where we don't want to kill each other, but then also hinting at the need for, this progressive chain of equivalence that would unite people. And I don't know if she'd speak about it in a positive sense. It's more for her, it's more like we're against something, right? But I think, you could talk about how religious conversion, psychic conversion as being essential to the construction of that chain of equivalence that would make cosmopolis really sort of work in practice. I don't know if that makes sense.
I think so.
Today, I apologize.
No, it's great. I'll probably be more rambly here, but what you just said somehow sparked something with Burns, with Pat's question about, well, how did she get out of her own thing? And I'm wondering if cosmopolis has a way of saying openness to the other is not just about being open to the other. It's openness to the other for the goal of reaching the truth, right? That there is actually one right way of being in society. And that might be a broad way that involves a lot of different possibilities within, but you could step back and say, this is the one right way, and things outside of this are not correct, right? But cosmopolis, I think, is a way of saying that the openness that leads to the right society is not just about, accepting other ideas and other thoughts. It's about considering them in order to, as a society as a whole, hopefully, if we're all in this state of cosmopolis mind or whatever it is, moving towards the right, whether it's the one right thing or multiple things that we could choose between that. But if that doesn't give some possibility for saying, okay, we both need to be open and seeing us all as a society together, but also recognize as a society, we should be heading in one direction rather than these other directions. And therefore, for her especially, right, radical democracy, this kind of progressive movement is where we need to go.
Yeah, so I would agree with you. I think she has a hard time she has a hard time thinking about, that phrase, and it's a phrase that sort of Pat used as well, right? Like the one correct way of sort of organizing society, or the one way that, the one sort of understanding of the common good we should all be sort of moving towards and sort of pursuing. She has a hard time distinguishing between, what we might call sort of thick and thin conceptions of the good, right? Like for her, there's really society, if we're going to talk about society being unified in any way, that would require sort of the imposition, right, of a sort of thick conception of the good that would, exclude others in a sort of in a sort of pejoratively ideological way. Whereas I think, and I think that's one of the interesting things that Lonergan is able to help maybe Mouffe do, right, is to recognize that there is a thin conception of the good that, that you can sort of tease out, that is really a thematization of sort of the implications of self-appropriation that could guide people who don't necessarily agree on all of the little details. Do you know what I mean? Like the answers we give to the question that is the human spirit are in many cases going to be different. But what is it that unifies us in spite of that, right? And I think she gets partway there, recognizing that, as I said before, at least as I see it, that not all differences are dialectical. We don't need to somehow, exclude and punish or try to kill our enemy. Like whoever's different than us is an enemy. And I think Lonergan's sort of hinting at the possibility, hey, we can have a thin conception of the good, a thin conception of community. Not all differences lead to communal breakdown, right? Some differences are just, we have to live with them, right? In terms of cultural and religious sort of diversity. And Lonergan's hinting at the possibility of something that will unify us amidst those differences, but he's not falling afoul of, sort of Mouffe's critique of, a classicist conception of the good that would sort of say there's one way to be, and we're going to impose it on you, like a Christendom sort of project. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, it does. Thanks.
Thank you, Steve and Nick. Professor Byrne, go ahead.
I just wanted to jump in with a concern I have, maybe a caution about talking about this in any way as the right way to live or the right way to organize society. Cosmopolis, Lonergan says it's an X. It would have been nice if you said a little bit more about what the X is. But at least my construal of it has a lot more to do with the way forward than it has to do with where we're supposed to get to. There are many, many different dimensions to it, but key to it is that explanatory knowledge is important in thinking about the way forward. And so he has in mind a transformed set of social sciences that are self-reflective, that are self-appropriated, and that deal with the problem of the biases. It gets much more fleshed out in method and theology, that the key to dialectic is ultimately to bring the investigator. In method and theology, it's the theologian, but I think it's extendable to the social sciences. The point to the functional specialty of dialectic is to bring the social scientist, the theologian, the philosopher to confront themselves through dialectic and dialogue with other points of view. So in some really fundamental way, Cosmopolis has dialectic in Lonergan's particular sense of dialectic at the heart of it, and given what he has to say in the dialectic of authority, there's a need for some people in the community who can make that way forward acceptable to the community, put it in its own terms as to why this way of proceeding is the right way of proceeding, and taking the question of one's own authenticity in the proposals that one's putting forward, whether they're scientific or political, is kind of crucial to what he thinks of as Cosmopolis.
Yeah, that's really well said, Pat. I think that's a really helpful addition to what we were just talking about and clarification, right? And I would say that that's that was sort of in the back of my mind, right? Like how does one think about the role of the creative minority in doing that, for example, right? And, Mouffe will talk about sort of, Gramsci's understanding of organic sort of intellectuals as well, right? As being sort of, I think there's a connection, I think, between those two. Lonergan folks, there's always, I think, a tendency for Lonergan folks to sort of float above, all of the sort of mess of everyday sort of living. That's a tendency, I think. And, what role can the creative minority play from within that sort of internal proletariat, right? To sort of galvanize and to cultivate, a direction for the movement forward, as you put it. I think it's a really good point.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you, Professor Byrne. Brian, you've got a question. Go ahead.
It's actually more of a comment, because I totally agree with what Pat just said, and I think it's a really helpful caution, because maybe I'm just irreducibly a student of Bob Dorrance, but I am, and in fact I know I am. But when I teach Cosmopolis, I basically just say straight up that it's a heuristic. It's got to be a heuristic, and the way I would understand it to be so is that it's basically what Bob traces the broad contours of in theology and the dialectics of history. I mean, he names the problems throughout it, but what is Cosmopolis if not fidelity to the integral scale of values, conformity with the law of the cross, and on both an individual and a communal level, attentiveness, intelligence, reasonableness, responsibility, and lovingness. And I think Nick's point is very well taken about Mouffe, where, of course, at the end of the day, she's going to have a preference. And I know Nick likes the Big Lebowski as much as I do. I've got a Lebowski Fest poster over there, actually. So the response that a lot of people would give to her solution is, well, that's just like your opinion, man. And she'd say, yeah, exactly, it is. And of course, I would have a particular preference for how that would shake out and look, but it wouldn't be definitive because it wouldn't be definitively Cosmopolis, because Cosmopolis is a heuristic as idea, at least the way I read it. That's my 2 cents. So thank you both very much.
Oh, that's well said. Yeah.
Thank you. Father Doran, I saw your hand next. Go ahead. And you're still muted.
Well, is my voice there? How's that? There's a recent book by Martha Nussbaum on the cosmopolitan tradition. Has anybody seen that? She doesn't mention Lonergan at all, but she talks about the ideal of Cosmopolis and thinkers in the Western tradition, starting with Cicero. And she says they all promote something very, very noble at the level of what we would call, following Lonergan's description, cultural values, but they don't hit the road when it comes to what we might refer to as the social distribution of the equitable distribution of vital goods with social institutions that are equipped to provide that. So this is her critique of a whole tradition in Western thought. And I don't know whether Lonergan had that tradition in mind. I mean, Cosmopolis has been used by previous authors in Western thinking, and I don't know whether he was thinking of any of them when he used the category. And how would he, is her critique also applicable to what he's doing or not? I haven't had time to really reflect on this question, so I'm just going to put it out there. But I think I was interested to see the book. I read the first chapter of the book. Has anybody read it? Anybody read?
Oh, it's on my list now, Bob.
Okay.
I just bought it on Amazon. What are you talking about?
That's hilarious.
I think I saw another hand earlier.
There was another hand up.
Oh, Steve, there we go. All right, go ahead.
Yeah, I had just, and this might be excessive at this point, but just to clarify on Cosmopolis that, Brian, I wasn't necessarily saying it's not a heuristic, or I'm not necessarily saying that kind of when I talk about the right way.
I wasn't implying that you were. I think it's just building on Pat to drive home we need to remind ourselves of that absolutely constantly, because it's got to be an ongoing process of discernment. I didn't mean to cut you off. It's just if I came off that way, I wasn't intending to.
Yeah, no, I wasn't offended by it. Just trying to clarify also. But yeah, but just I guess I would just then say, remember it's a heuristic, but also remember that heuristics are intended to point us towards what is or what is right, and not towards something else. So there has to be something that that's the reason for using the heuristic, right? As opposed to not using a heuristic or using an incorrect heuristic, is it has to lead to something. And so that's pretty much it. Yeah. Yeah. I guess just confirming that the right way, I'm not necessarily saying is this, that I have a vision of what this looks like and I'm just trying to get there somehow, but that it is in the process, like you said, of how am I going through this, this heuristic, I guess.
And I didn't mean to imply that either. Yeah, I think that's so I appreciate the clarification around this point. I think one of the things I was trying to say was that Mouffe would think that that's the only way to think about, for example, a conception of the good that might sort of, a thick conception of the good that would shape the sort of social order. And she wants to avoid going there, right? But doesn't have the heuristic tools, I think, to get there in the sort of way that you're sort of speaking. And I mean, the clearest example would be, if knowledge and value and goodness are just empty signifiers, no, the transcendental notions are transcendental, they're heuristic, and they do guide us towards a certain sort of goal. And Mouffe can't say that. Mouffe can't say that, at least not on her own terms.
Okay, thank you. Well, I actually have a comment or a question based off of both what Brian and Nick have said. One of the thoughts that I had, especially about the comments on the rigged election and how the dialectic of authority and how we declare what is authoritative and not, in conjunction with this victimization from the Trump clan, it's something that those two things together are really frightening me. And I wondered if you could speak more to how those two things can be overcome, especially when so many people resist self-appropriation because of biases. Yeah.
The two things again, so the rigged election and
the victimization of Trump and his clan, I suppose. That's the word I'll use.
Yeah. No, it's a great question. And I'm Canadian, so so there's it's definitely still pressing for me. Brian, did you want to take a shot first?
Oh, I figured she was asking you, bud.
Go ahead, Brian.
You know what's super funny is my answer. I'm not good at brevity. Or my question. That was an interesting Freudian slip. My question to Nick was actually born of me laboring over a bunch of different things over the course of the lecture, because the authority thing sparked that. I had that exact thought. Maybe you articulated it much better than I did, because I couldn't get it out as I was sort of thinking about it. I don't necessarily have an answer to that, because frankly, I am part of the reason that I asked the question the way that I did is I don't think it's just reducible to a political problem. I think it certainly is a political problem, but I framed it theologically because I do think it's a profanation of, that was what occurred to me as I was thinking about it. It is a profanation, not just of, but plenty of people claim to be victims all the time. There have been victims really all throughout history. And there have been people who have misappropriated that label. I suppose that what really scares me is that the very thing that Girard, his entire project in a certain sense, is about how the mechanisms that Christ unmasks are overcome through the victory that is what we would call the law of the cross, frankly, destroying and defeating death, but obviously we're still dealing with the ramifications of that until we reach an eschatological horizon beyond ours. There's something deeper about the profanation, I think, with Trump in that regard than just a political idolatry of sort of an Americanism or something like that. I think it's a warping of that unmasking of the mechanism itself. I think the way he deals with religion is much darker than a lot of other similar parallels. I agree with what Pat said in the chat, that there are certainly parallels between him and Nixon, or him and Nixon, that is. But I think this is scarier because I do actually think that it's it's deeper. And I'm still mulling over what precisely I mean by that, but I'm speaking sweepingly on sort of a cultural level in terms of the way that applies. But your question, which is the thing I don't quite know how to disentangle, is how do you affect, so what Hannah Ferguson was talking about earlier is a culture of encounter. On an individual level, if the biases are that deeply ingrained and if the worship of this cult of Trumpism and these different sort of factors that are bound up in it are, if they're so deeply ingrained in people in such a biased and problematic way and so bound up with race and so many other different homophobia, transphobia, xenophobia, all these different things, what do we do on an individual level? I don't have an answer to that. I wish I did.
Right, yeah, and part of my fear is also in this victimization, if you can claim a rigged election as part of the victimization, and then our legitimate means of power are no longer legitimate. But I suppose that's a side point. I'd like to get to Liam, but he can have a chance. So go ahead, Liam.
Well, I was just thinking about something Brian said and some of the things Pat said. What kind of struck me is I think the perverse thing about Trump is that he's managed to and I remember Mark Morelli actually talking to me about this 5 years ago at West Coast Methodist Institute about the scary thing about Trump is he can be a lot smarter than people give him credit for. And I think the perverse thing is he's managed to somehow like geniusly or ingeniously divide the nation against itself in as much as he's simultaneously, to like use Baudrillardian terms, on the side of the left revealed like the desert of the real, that there is no real democracy anymore. He's essentially set himself up as a sort of total sovereign, but he's using that to uphold on the right this simulacra of you need me to defend democracy because I'm the only thing standing within me and you. So like he's set himself up in this sort of like cycle where what happens is he's become both sovereign and homo sacer to different sides of the country, and that's really scary because there's no way to get rid of that. You can't get rid of a sovereign without your revolution, but because he's become homo sacer in the other side, you can't sacrifice him because that'll lead to the counter reaction. So it is just a really scary situation.
That's very well said. I hadn't thought about it quite that way. That's very well said.
I agree. Very well said, Liam.
Thank you.
It looks like we also had a point here from Martin asking about, is not the left claiming to be victims as well? Is anyone willing to address that here?
I think that's fair. I think that totally makes sense. I think it depends how you define the left. But yeah, I mean, these dynamics are present on both sides of the spectrum, I would say, for sure. Yeah, I think that's a really fair point. And I mean, Angus Ritchie's book on inclusive populism is an interesting one. I mean, he was doing community organizing and looking at how, particularly the labor movement in the UK, not able to sort of connect, for example, with the constituencies that they were looking to serve in the first place. And then the sort of, these mechanisms are present in that as well. Yeah, I think that's fair.
Yeah, I agree. I think Nick's point's a good one where I think there's, and I mean, Nick is talking about the neoliberal project when he's referencing Mouffe. The left and the right, as we're classifying them, are all neoliberals within American politics. They're centrists, broadly speaking. I think part of what makes Trump so complicated is Trump is, in a certain sense, the Joker from The Dark Knight, but more self-serving. I don't think he's beholden to right-wing of neoliberal ideology. I think Trump is beholden to Donald Trump. And I think that that radically complicates things and actually does tip him into fascism in a way that's slightly different. That's not to say that there aren't people who are neoliberals that aren't self-serving, I think that they're self-serving within the confines of something about their neoliberal principles, whereas I think Trump used those neoliberal principles as self-serving to get elected, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I'm not a political theorist. It's more complicated than making it sound, but yeah.
And I think you can be a neoliberal individualist and not buy into sort of neoliberalism, sort of, universalist aspirations. I mean, I think that's what we've sort of seen, right? I mean, the breakdown of this idea that neoliberalism was, that there was this consensus around this, and that ultimately it's contingent, which is part of what Mouffe is trying to do, is to expose its contingency. But we've seen a migration really of individualist presuppositions, and Trump, in one sense, Brian, is like sort of the epitome of that. Right. I mean, and we've seen a migration of those presuppositions.
Yeah, he's the logical conclusion of it in a certain sense, in the most extreme way, which I think makes him, in a certain sense, transcend the system, so to speak.
That's fair. Yeah, that's fair. And I mean, COVID is a very clear example, I think, of this. Right-wing Christians who, are more concerned about, religious freedom in a classically neoliberal sense than they are about the welfare of others, but they're also xenophobic in a very clear way. I mean, classical neoliberalism was xenophobic in a sense because there was this sort of, superiority, but it's very different now. It's kind of out in the open now that everything is everything's up for grabs, and it's that whole mere power, right? I mean, you have folks who, if the commitment to dealing with others in the public square is nothing more than, well, we need to do this, and so we don't kill each other. That's really a terrible basis, because as you can see, as soon as you give folks like this an inch, they're just going to take. They're just going to take. And it's one of the reasons why integralism in the Catholic sort of context is so big right now.
Well, it's 5:08, and we've got Mass coming up in 7 minutes. So I'd actually like to wrap up here so we have enough time to transition from one to the other. However, I'd like to remind everyone that we will have a virtual happy hour after Mass, so you can come back to this channel. I'll be here, and I know Steve will be here, but we can all come back with our beverages of choice.
Nice.
And have a grand old conversation about everything that we learned today. So, nice. Nick, thank you so very much for your presentation. It was wonderful.
Oh, thank you. You guys are too kind. Anybody who has to listen to me, wow.
I know, right?
Yes, thank you all for your comments and questions. So you're free to go.